Code of Rule, written by Ryan Quinn, Part 1. The orc messenger with the scarred face hiked toward Eímear's gates, struggling her way up stone steps half her height. Eímear's ogres stopped to watch her. Ranked brutes leered at her from the distance looming over the path to the summit. Wealthier Gorians looked out from mound homes, ornamented with trophies from their dead enemies. Another observer watched the messengers approach from a tower, disgust filling both of his minds. This orc trod atop the mountain the ogre's blood families had shaped over lifetimes, pressing and tearing the very rock until it became city and palace and fortress and home. Still, she had been permitted on the lift to Eímear's second rise with a wordless lowering of spears. It was custom to treat lone visitors with curiosity. They could always be killed later. When the lift shivered to a stop, the messenger saw a dozen haggard orc slaves manning the pulleys. They slunk off one by one, casting glances at her over their shoulders. The messenger peered farther up the mountain. Just visible, jutting forth from Eímear's peak, was the outline of a vast balcony, the throne of the Imperator, where dwelled the ogre's sorcerer king. But it was a long climb from where she stood, breathing hard in the dusty open between filthy-smelling slave hovels, her nose crinkled. A cadre of enormous, elegant-robed ogres tromped toward her, moving with surprising quickness. The tallest and largest among them, clearly hurrying to be the first on the scene, was near in seconds, reeling to a stop like a downhill pushcart regaining control. He reeked of grease and animal fat mixed with perfume, though his straw-colored sleeveless robes were immaculate. They had been cleaned more recently than his body. The ogre's huge belly hung out of his clothing, and he hefted it with one hand to scrub beneath, not breaking eye contact with the messenger. His voice was silken.
"I am High Counselor Varog. I speak for the king. You may share your message until I am through with my meal, and then you may depart Eímear with your soft bones intact."
So saying, he produced a pungent-scented hunk of elk shoulder and took one crunching bite, spreading webs of white fat. It was half gone, meat and bone alike, and he immediately pursed his lips for another bite, a proven means to elicit haste. The messenger looked at each of the ogres in turn.
"I bring a message from Grommash Hellscream, War Chief of the Iron Horde, to all ogres of Nagrand." She paused. "If you wish to draw breath upon Draenor one day longer, you will earn your lives."
All of the ogres laughed. By the time they were finished, grit was trickling off the lift in response.
"Oh?"
Varog demurred, worrying gristled out his yellow teeth with a fingernail, not looking at her.
"Speak further, how?"
The messenger stretched out her words, annoyed.
"Crawl before the Iron Horde with your eyes down, empty your coffers into our hands, roll on your bellies and beg I do not care, prove your worth or be made extinct."
The last words came out in a snarl. Varag leaned forward, body curling as though he would fall upon her like a cave-in.
"Little one, we hold 100 orc families in chains."
He gestured with a chunk of meat at a slave plodding behind a feed cart.
"Hellscream may not value your life, but will he behave so flippantly with theirs?"
The messenger looked straight up at the ogre.
"They are dead already."
She turned to leave. Her phrasing was particular. Prove your worth, not submit or surrender. The orcs of the Iron Horde were confident enough to be impudent, but they made no precise demands for tribute or territory restored. The ultimatum was open-ended. agencies was their listeners. The Sorcerer King had phrased similar demands so himself. Imperator Morgok, two-headed Sorcerer King of the High Mall. He whose ancestors had tamed avalanche and wind to build the first keeps and colonnades and reservoirs upon wild Nagrand, did not move from his balcony. The Imperator had been watching the day unfold at a distance. His vision stretched down to the High Mall streets through a lens of carved quartz. 4 natural eyes normally provided him with plenty to take in, but the hours he'd spent staring had begun to make one of his head swim. Was there more to see? Should he stop? It was a strange feeling conflict within his minds, when he had always felt his brains working together as 2 legs should. Morgok squinted, trying to imagine how one of his subjects, a 2-eyed, 1-headed, 1-brained ogre, would peer down at the splendor of the city. Would he focus his entire gaze, all his thoughts, on a single point in time? It would be impossible to rule that way. Everything would seem blurry. Morgok saw the baggy blobs of his counselors walk back from their meeting, stopping among the gardens, likely to argue. Then he watched the russet brown dot of the messenger as she left. The attack was not long off. Such a message was always delivered as an afterthought, not a prelude. Howls echoed through Morgok's streets from every direction, as though Draenor itself had been surrounded by wolves. Beyond the western parapets, spheres of smoke and flame tumbled through the air toward glorious High Mall. If they impacted the outer walls, drum towers would topple, clogging pathways down the mountain. The forces of High Mall's upper rises would be cut off from the supporting the lower. The lifts were too slow. Relief forces rushing through the breach were likely to lose their footing among the rubble and get slaughtered in droves, their bodies transforming from instruments of war to hurdles for their fellows. Or the Iron Horde would bound up the eastern sculpture path on the back of their deft wolves, whose jaws would drip red as they bit open ogres' stomachs. High Mall's eastern line of defenses was nearly all brutes, and they had a habit of responding to charges by tossing their spears aside in the hope of cracking puny jawbones in their hands before dying. Had they been lashed recently? What if the orcs sped past their lines and gained access to the slave pens? Could they arm the slaves, raise a revolt? The risks were many. Imperator Morgok contemplated them as the patter of arrows grew audible on his balcony. He decided. Commanded. He had ordered all slaves to be barricaded in their pens. Any who were unruly were to be slaughtered on the spot. The bodies lent to flies would be locked inside with the living. The lowest tier of High Mall, where dwelled smaller, poorer, unproven Gorians, would receive the immediate assault. Morgok ordered a throng of sentinels there, seasoned warriors to halt their enemies' ascent. The sentinels carried the Imperator's standards of purple and gold, and their bellowing shook rocks from the hills. At the vanguard, red-skinned Gorian magic breakers charged unarmed through their enemies' glowing spells, crumpling orcish bodies beneath the sweeps of mighty clubs and stomping throats flat. Yet more of the Iron Horde came on. Ragtag war-song riders fought side by side with other orcs, painted howlers who decorated their faces in whirls of blood, squads of helmeted infantry without a hint of muscle exposed beneath sooty steel plates. Maimed, fanatics swarmed to the gladiator Kargoth, with blades in place of their hands. The only characteristics they all seemed to share was an insignia, a spiky red crawl adorning banners and shields, and weapons. Every drop of ingenuity in the Horde had gone toward its means of killing. How had they invented so much so quickly? It was as if generations of progress had fallen into their laps. Teams of orcs, straining behind their catapult chains, sent wheels of fire screeching through the sky, setting alight ogre flesh and melting walls into mortar. In the orc's hands, dual-pointed blades spun like wheels, steel wagons staggering forward on spider-like legs. Carried soldiers over the moats that had once made Morgoth's city so impregnable. The Iron Horde was surrounding High Mall's defenders, even on the narrow pathways that ogres filled shoulder to shoulder. 5 orcs stood inside a metal ram topped with a fire-spewing fist. Charging up a livestock path towards the city, ogres fell before the ram like great burning effigies, until it squelched to a stop against one hammer-wielding brute. In a gush of sparks, he toppled off the path with half of his chest bored through, and the exit hole sputtering ash. The orcs took no prisoners, even atop Imperator's Rise, at the pinnacle of High Mall. The smoke and the charnel scent of dying ogres reached both sets of Morgoth's nostrils. His belly burbled eagerly. As the Iron Horde ate up his city from its toes, the Sorcerer King of the High Mall stood far above the carnage, surrounded by the wrought shale pillars of his first great project, the halls of the Guidotti. Morgoth's council spanned the wide floor. They were great, ancient ogres, hunched like resting tigers, or posing godlike atop huge stones they've carried up several flights. At a respectful distance from the council, stock-still rows of military advisors and champions waited, bearing bludgeons and worn armor. A few exhibited the strange red, blue, or gray collaborations and archaic tattoos that marked them as magic breakers. Warriors subjected to the rituals and trainings that rendered them immune to spell schools. A decree the Sorcerer King levied on 1 in 20 Gorians during his reign. The breakers' faint success in holding back the Iron Horde was evident in their posture. They looked fully prepared to spring from the discussion and maim High Mall's enemies at a moment's notice. There were no places to sit. Several counselors paced the Guidotti's floor, orbiting the Imperator. The largest ogre among them, a gargantuan creature, whose muscle and fat took turns dominating his image. A long horn punched up from his right head. A purple sash puddled around his feet. Beneath his hoods, Morgoth's jaws were clenched in study. He held collused palms open toward the assembly. Of all in the room, only High Counselor Varag looked more eager.
"Our primalists will shatter the North Slope," he spat. "The North Peak will fall, and it will slide down upon them and squish their small heads all at once."
The grease on his face twinkled. As they listened to Varag, a few of the council members looked ready to swallow his blood, but most, particularly the magic breakers, stamped in agreement. This was a hall of both governance and violence. Those who disagreed too long would bash in one another's skull to support their points. Finding common ground was crucial. Morgoth growled, his voice echoing in the chamber.
No!
Impatient, hungry, low-born Varag, his thoughts ever on rising, looked as though he had been sent to die in the Colosseum. Staring at Varag with one head, while the other scanned the council crowd, Morgoth let their mumbles dwindle.
The orcs and their weapons are too great in number. They will not be destroyed in one strike, and you risk the foundation of the city. No, our legions at the front will retreat to the path of victors, and force them to ascend. If they need ropes to climb our steps, they can be slowed.
High Mall had squished every attempt to settle within leagues of Her Majesty. The enemy would be tired from marching, riding. A true siege of the city could take days. The Iron Horde's supply trains would need to be substantial. Varag was powerful. a mage lord with many victories and an unusual knack for both disobedience and survival.
By letting them into the city, you give them the initiative. Even if we cripple their supplies or cut their ropes, they will leave our warriors with little hope of escape.
Escape?
Mused Margok.
You think then that Eímear will fall?
Silence. Margok rolled a stone in his palm. It had been worn smooth by his calluses.
You think,
he clicked one tongue,
preventing death among our army is more valuable than preventing the death of Eímear?
No one said so, but no one spoke to deny it. The pitch of Varrig's voice rose.
Imperator, you are far from the battlefield. You cannot see our soldiers or our armies. If you will let us bring down the mountain, then let us meet with our full force. If we retreat, our losses will be great. You will regret each after we have won.
Varrig's words echoed, and most of the councillors moved away from him to stand beside the Imperator. Their support to Quieter for being wordless. Noticing them, Varrig looked even more erect.
The orcs are so small that they will not even be able to remove our dead, he snarled.
Margok's faces remained outward stolid.
Perhaps it is simpler than I thought. Join me and use your vast knowledge of the Iron Horde to bring us victory.
Join you, Imperator? You will fight?
No. While our forces pull back and stymie the orcs, we travel to the Iron Horde war chief and make him show us peace. By sending his messengers, Gromish Hellscream has all but promised us safe passage.
A few centurions and one additional magic breaker would serve as the Emperor's personal guard. He did not dare borrow more from the front lines. Swiveling his heads towards the magic breakers, Margok boomed.
The strongest among you will accompany me.
Margok dismayed to see a blue breaker covered in messy runes that looked as though they had been scraped onto his body with a rock, promptly shoved forward by his fellows. Apparently, the breaker shared his Imperator's dismay.
Imperator,
he intoned gravely.
I have crushed 4 shaman skulls tonight. I am not fit to trade sweet words. Let me stay and fight for the glory of Eímear. What is your name, Breaker?
Margok asked, slowly, softly, as though speaking to a meal.
Koroth, Imperator.
Koroth, Margok continued.
You may not stay. Your death will buy Eímear less than your life. Further,
Margok cuts off the possibility of ejection, and the breaker's maw slaps shut.
The time and manner of your death are your Imperator's to choose. Do you understand?
At that, Koroth saluted, one meaty fist thumping his chest. Varrog, never one to let others be the focus of attention far more than a moment, was quick to raise his voice.
And how will I serve, Imperator?
Margok allowed himself to show smiles.
You will drag my cart.
The High Counselor gaped open-mouthed. A few in the assembly chuckled nervously. The sound like 2 rocks dragging against each other. The Imperator had long encouraged his council to show non-violent dissent at any time. They merely had to spit at his feet. None of his living counselors ever expressed disagreement in the discourteous fashion he suggested, but the offer had been made nonetheless. He was magnanimous. Margok looked pointedly at his bare toes, then back at the assemblage. Rolling fire passed by a window, spraying hot metal pebbles into the rise. He furrowed the brow of his left face, then the right. The Imperator looked down at his feet again. No spit. End of part 1.